The Hinterkaifeck case is a mess. It's been nearly 100 years, and we still don't know who did it. 6 people killed with a pickaxe on a remote German farm. A family wiped out. The story is full of strange details. Incest, ghosts, footprints in the snow that led to the farm but not away. It feels like a dark fairy tale, and because it's so strange, people come up with strange theories. A jealous lover, a vengeful husband from the war, a family member snapping, a political assassination. They're all dramatic, they're all complicated, they make for good stories. But what if the answer is simple? What if it's the oldest story in the world? A story about money. What if the Hinterkaifeck murders were just a robbery that went horribly, terribly wrong? It's not a glamorous theory. It's not mysterious. It's just ugly and sad. But it might be the one that makes the most sense. It might be the simplest explanation. Let's start with the basics. Why would anyone target the Gruber family on their isolated farmstead, Hinterkaifeck? The answer is money. The Grubers were not poor. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was known in the area as being well off. He was also known for being secretive and mistrustful. He didn't use banks. When people talked, they whispered that he kept his life savings, a significant amount of gold marks, somewhere on the farm. In post-World War I Germany, this was a dangerous reputation to have. The country was broken. People were poor and desperate. There were soldiers returning from the war with no jobs, and a lot of trauma. There were drifters and vagrants roaming the countryside. A story about an old man sitting on a pile of cash in an isolated house is exactly the kind of story that would attract the wrong kind of attention. So, the motive is there. It's the most common motive for violent crime: greed. The target was perfect. Hinterkaifeck was not in a village. It was set off on its own, surrounded by woods. The nearest neighbors were a good distance away. No one would hear you scream. No one would see a strange light in the window. It was an ideal place to commit a crime without being seen or heard. It was vulnerable. Think about how a robbery might play out. The killer, or killers, wouldn't just knock on the front door. They'd be smarter than that. They would watch the farm. They would learn the family's routine. When does Andreas go to the barn? When do they eat dinner? When do they go to bed? This is just basic criminal planning. And this planning fits perfectly with one of the strangest clues in the case. The footprints in the snow. Days before the murders, Andreas Gruber told neighbors he found a set of footprints leading from the forest to the farm. But he couldn't find any tracks leading away. He also complained about hearing noises in the attic. A newspaper from Munich, one he didn't subscribe to, turned up on the property. A set of house keys went missing. These aren't signs of a ghost. These are signs of a prowler. Someone was casing the joint. The footprints show someone approaching the farm to watch. They didn't leave because they didn't go back to the forest. They stayed. Maybe they hid in the barn, or as Andreas suspected, in the attic. They were watching the family, learning their habits, waiting for the right moment to strike. The missing keys? The prowler probably took them to get easy access. The newspaper? Maybe he dropped it by accident while he was scouting. This explains another strange detail. The family's previous maid had quit just 6 months earlier. She claimed the house was haunted. She heard voices and footsteps. Was it a ghost, or was it the sound of someone hiding in the walls or the attic planning a crime? Someone who had been watching the farm for a very long time. So we have a motive: money, a target isolated farm, and evidence of planning the prowler. Now, let's think about the night of the murders. The popular theory is that the killer lured the family members into the barn one by one to kill them. How could that happen? It's not as difficult as it sounds, especially if you apply the robbery theory. Imagine, it's late on a Friday, the family has finished their day, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had only arrived a few hours earlier. The killer has been waiting, maybe for days, hidden somewhere on the property. He needs to get Andreas alone. Andreas is the strongest, the one most likely to put up a fight. So, the killer makes a noise in the barn. Maybe he lets a cow loose or knocks something over. Andreas, the diligent farmer, goes to investigate. It's dark. He walks into the barn. The killer is waiting. He strikes Andreas with the pickaxe, a tool from the farm itself. A weapon of opportunity. Andreas goes down. Now, the killer has a problem. He thought he could get Andreas alone, threaten him, and force him to give up the money. But things went too far, too fast. Maybe Andreas fought back. Maybe the killer panicked. Now Andreas is dead or dying on the barn floor. The robbery has already gone wrong. And then Kazelia, Andreas' wife, comes out to see what's taking him so long. She calls for him, she enters the barn, she sees the killer in her husband's body. She is a witness. The killer can't let her go, he panics again, he kills her too. The chain reaction continues. Victoria, the daughter, comes out with her own 7-year-old daughter, Kazelia. They are looking for Andreas and Kazilia Sr. They walk into the barn, they see the horror. And the killer, now committed to eliminating all witnesses, kills them both. The violence escalates with each new person who discovers the scene. It's not a calculated, cold-blooded plan to kill everyone. It's a series of panicked, brutal acts to cover up the initial crime. After killing the 4 people in the barn, the killer knows there's still 2 more inside the house. The new maid, Maria, and the baby, Yosef. He can't leave them. They are witnesses. He goes inside. He kills the maid in her bedchamber and the baby in his bassinet. It's a complete, systematic slaughter born not of hatred, but of a desperate, panicked need to leave no one alive who could identify him. This gone wrong scenario explains the sheer brutality and the killing of the entire family, including the children. A planned massacre for revenge might be more personal, more ritualistic, but a panicked slaughter to eliminate witnesses is just about efficiency. You use the weapon at hand, and you make sure everyone is dead. So what happens? The robbery part. The family is dead, the killer now has the farm to himself. He can finally search for the money he came for. And this is exactly what the police found. The house was ransacked, drawers were pulled out, cupboards were open, bedding was tossed around. Someone had clearly searched the house for valuables. This is direct evidence that the motive was, at least in part, robbery. This brings us to one of the biggest arguments against the robbery theory. The police found a large sum of money hidden in the house. If it was a robbery, why was the money left behind? This is a good question, but it doesn't sink the theory. First, just because there was money doesn't mean the robber found it. Andreas was known to be secretive and paranoid. He would have hidden his money well. A panicked killer, covered in blood and working in the dark, might not have been a very thorough searcher. He might have grabbed what was easy to find, maybe some petty cash, some silver, a piece of jewelry, and missed the main stash. He ransacked the place, which shows he was looking. He just wasn't successful. Second, think about the killer's state of mind. He has just brutally murdered 6 people, including 2 children and a baby. He is not a calm, rational professional. He is in a state of extreme shock and panic. His simple plan to rob an old man has turned into a bloodbath. He might have been too rattled to conduct a proper search. He might have just wanted to get out of there. He grabbed what he could and fled. The goal was no longer to get rich. It was to get away with mass murder. Or maybe he did find some money. Maybe the Grubers had more than one stash. Perhaps the police only found what the killer left behind. We'll never know for sure, but the fact that money was left doesn't automatically mean money wasn't the motive. It just means the robbery was a failure. Now for the other very weird detail. The killer apparently stayed at the farm for several days after the murders. Someone fed the cattle, someone ate food in the kitchen, smoke was seen coming from the chimney. A simple robber would run. Why would the killer hang around? This is the hardest part to explain, for any theory. But there are possible explanations that fit the robbery gone wrong scenario. One is that the killer wasn't alone. Maybe it was a pair of robbers or a small group. After the murders, they split up. One person stayed behind for a day or two to create the illusion that everything was normal. Smoke from the chimney, cows being fed. This would stop any neighbors from getting suspicious right away. It would give the other killers a head start to get far away. Another possibility is that the killer was local. He knew that disappearing from the area immediately after the murders would look suspicious. His best bet might have been to lay low for a day or two, and what better place to hide than at the scene of the crime, a place no one would think to look for him yet. He could eat their food, stay warm by their fire, and wait until the coast was clear to slip back into his normal life. This would also explain why he knew how to take care of the livestock. He was probably a farmer or a farmhand himself. There's also a simpler, more psychological explanation. The killer was in shock. He committed a horrific act and didn't know what to do next, so he just stayed. He acted on instinct. The cows were making noise, so he fed them. He was hungry, so he ate. He was on autopilot, living in a daze in the house of the people he had just murdered. It's a strange thought, but human beings do strange things under extreme stress. He wasn't a monster from a movie. He was a desperate human being who had crossed a line and found himself in a nightmare of his own making. The farm was isolated. It was, for a short time, the safest place for him to be while he figured out what to do next. When you put all these pieces together, the robbery gone wrong theory starts to look very solid. It provides a clear and understandable motive: money. It explains why the isolated farm was targeted. It makes sense of the prowler clues before the murders, reframing them as a criminal casing the property. It provides a plausible, step-by-step account of how a robbery could escalate into a mass murder through panic and the need to eliminate witnesses. It accounts for the ransacked state of the house, and it offers several possible if unsettling, explanations for the money being left behind and the killer lingering at the scene. So, who could the killer have been? The theory points away from the named suspects like Lorenz Schlittenbauer or Carl Gabriel. Their motives were personal, tied to love and family. A robbery gone wrong points to someone anonymous, a stranger. It could have been a pair of drifters, desperate men who heard a rumor in a beer hall about the wealthy farmer at Hinterkaifeck. They planned the robbery, but they were amateurs. They weren't prepared for resistance, and it all fell apart. After the murders, they fled the region and were never connected to the crime. This explains why no local was ever convincingly identified. The killers weren't local. Or it could have been a local person. Someone from a nearby village who was in debt. Someone who knew the Grubers personally, at least by sight. He would have known Andreas was old and that the farm was isolated. He might even worked for Andreas in the past or knew someone who did. This would explain his knowledge of the farm's layout and how to care for the animals. After the crime, he simply went back to his life, hiding in plain sight, a murderer among his neighbors. His guilt would have been a terrible secret, but perhaps one he took to his grave. But this type of killer is much harder to catch. There's no passionate, personal connection to the victims for the police to trace. The motive isn't personal. It's just about the money. The crime is not about the Grubers as people, it's about what they had. This makes the pool of potential suspects enormous. It could have been almost anyone in Bavaria who was poor, desperate, and knew about the farm. Compared to the other theories, this one feels more grounded in reality. The theory of the vengeful husband, Carl Gabriel, returning from the war to find his wife had a child with her own father is dramatic, but it requires him to have survived the war in secret, returned without anyone knowing, and then disappeared again forever. It's a lot of speculation. The theory of a family feud, perhaps Lorenz Schlittenbauer killing them over a dispute about the paternity of the baby Josef, is also popular. But while his behavior after discovering the bodies was odd, it's a huge leap from odd behavior to the slaughter of 6 people, including 2 children he seemed to care for. His motive feels thin for such a horrific crime. The robbery gone wrong theory doesn't require any of these narrative leaps. It relies on the most basic and brutal aspects of human nature. People have always killed for money. Desperate people do desperate things. A confrontation turns violent. Panic sets in. One bad decision leads to another and another until a barn is filled with bodies. It also explains the weapon. The murder weapon was a mattock, a farm tool. It was almost certainly from the Gruber's own tool shed. A killer bent on personal revenge might have brought his own weapon, something more personal like a knife or a pistol. But a robber, especially an opportunistic one, would use what was available. He wasn't planning a murder, he was planning a robbery. The pickaxe was just a tool that was there when things went south. It's the simplest explanation, and in crime, the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Occam's razor, the idea that you shouldn't invent complicated stories when a simple one will do. The story of Hinterkaifeck is already filled with so much darkness, the family's internal secrets, the isolation, the sheer brutality of the end. We don't need to add a phantom soldier or a complex conspiracy to make it horrifying. The horror might be that it was for nothing, that 6 people were wiped from the earth because someone thought they could get some money. They didn't get the money, they just killed. They killed a family, they killed children, and then they just faded away. There is no grand mystery to solve. There is only a grubby, pathetic, and ultimately successful crime. Successful in that the killer was never caught. It's an unsatisfying conclusion. We want killers to have complex motives. We want them to be figures of great evil or tragic passion. We don't want them to be a random, desperate person who made a series of bad, panicked choices. We want the story to mean something, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just a story about a prowler who saw an opportunity, tried to take it, and ended up committing one of Germany's most infamous mass murders out of sheer pathetic incompetence. And then he fed the cows, ate some bread, and walked away. That is a truly chilling thought. Much more chilling than any ghost. It's a reminder of the simple, brutal violence that can erupt when greed meets desperation. And that, perhaps, is the real truth of Hinterkaifeck. It wasn't a mystery. It was just a robbery.